Hello, welcome. I'm Helene, and this has been put on my heart to do because I've been begging a lot of people to read this book for the longest since I've discovered it existed, and since I have the hard copy, and I've had this hard copy for quite some time now. It is my duty to share some of its passages, and this is The Source of Self-Regard, selected essays, speeches, and meditations by Toni Morrison, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. The first part of the book, Part 1, The Foreigner's Home. It's titled, The Dead of September 11. Some have God's words. Others have songs of comfort for the bereaved. If I could pluck up courage here, I would like to speak directly to the dead, the September dead, those children of ancestors born in every continent on the planet. Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, born of ancestors who wore kilts, obies, saris, gilets, white straw hats, goatskin, wooden shoes, feathers, and cloths to cover their hair. But I would not say a word until I could set aside all I know or believed about nations, war, leaders, the governed and ungovernable, all I suspect about armor and entrails. First I would freshen my tongue, abandon sentences crafted to know evil, wanton or studied, explosive or quietly sinister, whether born of sated appetite or hunger, of vengeance or the simple compulsion to stand up before falling down. I would purge my language of hyperbole, of its eagerness to analyze the levels of wickedness, ranking them, calculating their higher or lower status among others of its kind. Speaking to the broken and the dead is too difficult for a mouthful of blood, too holy an act for impure thoughts, because the dead are free, absolute. They cannot be seduced by bliss. To speak to you, the dead of September, I must not claim false intimacy or summon an overheated heart glazed just in time for a camera. I must be steady and I must be clear, knowing all the time that I have nothing to say, no word stronger than the steel that pressed you into itself, no scripture older or more elegant than the ancient atoms you have become, and I have nothing to give either except this gesture, this thread thrown between your humanity and mine. I want to hold you in my arms, and as your soul got shot of its box of flesh, to understand, as you have done, the wit of eternity, its gift of unhinged release tearing through the darkness of its name, titled The Foreigner's Home. Excluding the height of the slave trade in the 19th century, the mass movement of peoples in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century is greater now than it has ever been. It is a movement of workers, intellectuals, refugees, armies crossing oceans, continents, immigrants through custom offices and hidden routes, speaking multiple languages of trade, of political intervention, of persecution, exile, violence, and poverty. There is little doubt that the redistribution, voluntary or involuntary, of people all over the globe tops the agenda of the state, the boardrooms, the neighborhoods, the streets. Political maneuvers to control this movement are not limited to monitoring the dispossessed. While much of this exodus can be described as the journey of the colonized to the seat of the colonizer, slaves as it were, abandoning the plantation for the planter's home. And while more of it is the flight of war refugees, the relocation and transplantation of the management and diplomatic class to the globalization's outposts, as well as the deployment of fresh military units and bases, feature prominently and legislative attempts to control the constant flow of people. The spectacle of mass movement draws attention inevitably to the borders, the poorest places, the vulnerable points where one's concept of home is seen as being menaced by foreigners. Much of the alarm hovering at the borders, the gates, is stoked, it seems to me, by 1. Both the threat and the promise of globalism, and 2. An uneasy relationship with our own foreignness, our own rapidly disintegrating sense of belonging. Let me begin with globalization. In our current understanding of globalization is not a version of the 19th century Britannia rules format, although post-colonial upheavals reflect and are reminiscent of the domination one nation had over most others. The term does not have the workers of the world unite agenda of the old internationalism, although that was the very word, internationalism, that the president of the AFL-CIO used at the Executive Council of Union Presidents. Nor is the globalism the post-war appetite for one world, the rhetoric that stirred and bedeviled the 50s and launched the United Nations. Nor is it the universalism of the 60s and 70s, either as a plea for world peace or an insistence on cultural hegemony. Empire, internationalism, one world, universal, all seem less like categories of historical trends than yearnings. Yearnings to coral the earth into some semblance of unity and some measure of control, to conceive of the planet's human destiny as flowing from one constellation of nations' ideology. Globalism has the same desires and yearnings as its predecessors. It too understands itself as historically progressive, enhancing, destined, unifying, utopian. Narrowly defined, it is meant to mean instant movement of capital and the rapid distribution of data and products operating within a politically neutral environment shaped by multinational corporate demands. Its larger connotations, however, are less innocent, encompassing as they do not only the demonization of embargoed states or the trivialization cum negotiations with warlords, but also the collapse of nation states under the weight of transnational economies, capital, and labor, the preeminence of Western culture and economy, the Americanization of the developed and developing world through the penetration of U.S. culture into others, as well as the marketing of the third world cultures to the West as fashion, film, settings, and cuisine. Globalization, held with the same vigor as was manifest destiny, internationalism, etc., has reached a level of majesty in our imagination. For all its claims of fostering freedom, globalism's dispensations are royal, for it can bestow much in matters of reach across frontiers, in terms of mass, of populations affected and engaged, and in terms of riches, limitless fields to mine for resources and services to offer. Yet as much as globalism is adored as near messianic, it is also reviled as an evil courting a dangerous dystopia. Its disregard of borders, national infrastructures, local bureaucracy, internet censors, tariffs, laws, and languages, its disregard of margins and the marginal people who live there, its formidable engulfing property, accelerating erasure, and flattening out of differences of specificity for marketing purposes, an abhorrence of diversity. We imagine indistinguishability, the elimination of minority languages, minority cultures in its wake. We speculate with horror on what could be the irrevocable enfeebling altercation of major languages, major cultures in its sweep, even if those dreaded consequences are not made completely manifest. They nevertheless cancel out globalism's assurances of a better life by ensuing dire warnings of premature cultural death. Other dangers globalism poses are the distortion of the public and the destruction of the private. We glean what is public primarily, but not exclusively, from the media. We are asked to abandon much of what was once private to the data collecting requirements of governmental, political, market, and now security needs. Part of the anxiety about the porous divide between public and private domain certainly stems from reckless applications of the terms. There is the privatizations of prisons, which is the private corporate control of public facility. There is the privatization of public schools. There is also private life, claims to which can be given up freely on talk shows or negotiated in the courts by celebrities, public figures, and privacy right cases. There is private space, atrium, gardens, etc., open to the public, and public spaces, parks, playgrounds, and beaches in certain neighborhoods, limited to private use. There is the looking glass phenomenon of the play of the public in our private interior lives. Interiors of our houses look like store displays, along with shelf after shelf of collections. And store displays are arranged as house interiors. Young people's behavior is said to be an echo of what the screen offers. The screen is said to represent youthful interests and behaviors, not create them. Since the space in which both civic and private life is lived has become so indistinguishable from inner and outer, from inside outside, these two realms have been compressed into a ubiquitous blur, a rattling of our concept of home. It is this rattling, I believe, that affects the second point, our easiness with our own feelings of foreignness, our own rapidly fraying sense of belonging. To what do we pay greatest allegiance? Family, language group, culture, country, gender, religion, race? And if none of these matter, are we urbane, cosmopolitan, or simply lonely? In other words, how do we decide where we belong? What convinces us that we do? Or put it another way, what is the matter with foreignness? I have chosen to comment on a novel written in the 50s by a Ghanaian author as means of addressing this dilemma. The inside-out blur that can enshrine frontiers and border real, metaphorical, or psychological. As we wrestle with the definition of nationalism, citizenship, race, ideology, and the so-called clash of cultures in our search to belong, African and African American writers are not alone in coming to terms with these problems, but they do have a long and singular history of confronting them, of not being at home in one's homeland, of being exiled in the place one belongs. Before I discuss this novel, I want to describe what preceded my reading of African literature and compelled my excursion into what troubles contemporary definition of the foreign. Velvet-lined offering plates were passed down the pews on Sunday. The last one was the smallest and the one most likely to be empty. Its position and size signaled the dutiful but limited expectations that characterized most everything in the 30s. The coins, never bills, sprinkled there were mostly from children encouraged to give up their pennies and nickels for the charitable work so necessary for the redemption of Africa. Although the sound of the name Africa was beautiful, it was riven by the complicated emotions with which it was associated. Unlike starving China, Africa was both ours and theirs, intimately connected to us and profoundly foreign. A huge, needy homeland to which we were said to belong, but that none of us had seen or cared to see, inhabited by people with whom we maintained a delicate relationship of mutual ignorance and disdain, and with whom we shared a mythology of passive, traumatized otherness, cultivated by textbooks, film, cartoons, and the hostile name calling children learn to love. Later, when I began to read fiction set in Africa, I found that, with no exception I knew of, each narrative elaborated on and enhanced the very mythology that accompanied those velvet plates floating between the pews. For Joyce Carey, Elspeth Huxley, H. Rider Haggard, Africa was precisely what the missionary collection plate implied: a dark continent in desperate need of light. The light of Christianity, of civilization, of development. The light of charity switched on by simple good-heartedness. It was an idea of Africa fraught with assumption of a complex intimacy coupled with an acknowledgement of unmediated estrangement. The conundrum of foreign ownership alienated the local population of the dispossession of native speakers from their home. The exile of indigenous peoples within their home contributed a surreal glow to these narratives, enticing the writers to project a metaphysical void, Africa ripe for invention. With one or two exceptions, literary Africa was an inexhaustible playground for tourists and foreigners. In the works of Joseph Conrad, Isaac Dinson, Saul Bellow, Ernest Hemingway, whether imbued with or struggling against conventional Western view of benighted Africa, their protagonists found the continent to be as empty as that collection plate, a vessel waiting for whatever copper and silver imagination was pleased to place there, as grist for Western meals, accommodatingly mute, conveniently blank. Africa could be made to support a wide variety of literary and or ideological requirements. It could stand back as scenery for any exploit or leap forward and obsess itself with the woes of any foreigner. It could contort itself into frightening, malignant shapes upon which Westerners could contemplate evil, or it could kneel and accept elementary lessons from its betters. For those who made that literal or imaginative voyage, contact with Africa offered thrilling opportunity to experience life in its primitive, formative, inchoate state, the consequence of which experience was self-enlightenment, a wisdom that confirmed the benefits of Europe proprietorship, free of the responsibility of gathering overly much actual intelligence about the African culture that stimulated the Enlightenment. So big-hearted was the literary Africa. Only a little geography, lots of climate, a few customs and anecdotes suffice as the canvas upon which a portrait of a wiser or sadder or fuller reconciled self could be painted. In Western novels published up to and throughout the 50s, Africa was itself camus l'estrange, offering the occasion for knowledge but keeping its own unknowableness intact. Like Marlowe's White Patch, for a boy to dream gloriously over, mapped since his boyhood with rivers and lakes and names. It had ceased to be a blank space of delightful mystery. It had become a place of darkness. What little could be known was enigmatic, repugnant, or hopelessly contradictory. Imaginary Africa was a cornucopia of imponderables that, like the monstrous Grendel and Beowulf, resisted explanation. Thus, plethora of incompatible metaphors can be gleaned from the literature. As the original locus of the human race, Africa is ancient, yet being under colonial control, it is also infantile, a kind of old fetus always waiting to be born, but confounding all midwives. In novel after novel, short story after short story, Africa is simultaneously innocent and corrupting, savage and pure, irrational and wise. In that racially charged literary context, coming upon Camera Les Le Regard du Roi, known in English as The Radiance of the King, was shocking. Suddenly, the cliche journey into storybook African darkness, either to bring light or find it, is reimagined. The novel not only summons a sophisticated, wholly African imaginistic vocabulary from which to launch a discursive negotiation with the West, it exploits the images of homelessness that the conqueror imposes on the native population. The disorder of Joyce Carey, Mr. Johnson, the obsession with smells in Hespeth Huxley's The Flame Tree of the Tika, the European fixation on the meaning of nakedness as in H.R. Haggard's or Joseph Conrad's, or virtually all travel writings. Camarale's narrative is briefly this. Clarence, a European, has come to Africa for reasons he cannot articulate. There he has gambled, lost, and heavily in debt to the white compatriots. In hiding among the indigenous population in a dirty inn, already evicted from the colonist hotel, about to be evicted by the African innkeeper, Clarence decides the solution to his pennilessness is to be taken into the service of the king. He is prevented by a solid crowd of villagers from approaching the king, and his mission is greeted with scorn. He meets a pair of mischief-loving teenagers and cunning beggar who agree to help him. Under the guise, he travels south where the king is expected to appear next. By way of the journey, not wholly unlike A Pilgrim's Progress, the author is able to trace and parody the parallel sensibilities of Europe and Africa. The literary tropes of Africa are exact replicas of perceptions of foreignness, threatening, depraved, incomprehensible, and it is fascinating to observe Les Autroit's handling of those perceptions. 1. Threatening. Clarence, his protagonist, is stupefied with fear in spite of noting that the forests are devoted to the wine industry, that the landscape is cultivated, that the people living there give him a cordial welcome. He sees only inaccessibility, common hostility. The order and clarity of the landscape are at odds with the menacing jungle in his head. 2. Depraved. It is Clarence who descends into depravity, enacting the full horror of Westerners imagined as going native, the unclean and cloying weakness that imperils masculinity. Clarence's blatant enjoyment of and feminine submission to continuous cohabitation reflects his own appetite and his own willful ignorance as mulatto children crowd the village. Clarence, the only white in the region, continues to wonder where they came from. He refuses to believe the obvious. He has been sold as a stud for the harem. 3. Incomprehensible. Kamara Lay's Africa is not dark. It is suffused with light, the watery green light of the forest, the ruby red tint of the houses and soil, the sky unbearable azure brilliance, even the scale of the fish women, glimmer like robes of dying moonlight. Understanding the motives and sensibilities of the Africans, both wickedness and benign, requires only a suspension of belief in a unbreachable difference between humans. Unpacking the hobbled idioms of the foreigner, usurping one's home, and delegitimizing the native, of reversing claim of belonging, the novel allows us to experience a white man immigrating to Africa alone, without a job, without authority, without resources, or even a family name. But he has one asset that always works, can only work in a third world country. He is white. He says, and therefore suited in some ineffable way to be advisor to the king, whom he has never seen, in a country he does not know, among people he neither understands nor wishes to. What begins as a quest for a position of authority, for escape from the contempt of his own countrymen, becomes a searching process of re-education. What counts as intelligence among these Africans is not prejudice, but nuance and the ability and willingness to see, to surmise. The European's refusal to mediate cogently on any event except the one that concerned his comfort and survival dooms him. When insight finally seeps through, he feels annihilated by it. This fictional investigation allows us to see the deracing of a Westerner experiencing Africa without European support, protection, or command. Allows us to rediscover or imagine anew what it feels like to be marginal, ignored, superfluous, to have one's name never uttered, to be stripped of history or representation, to be sold or exploited, labor for the benefit of a presiding family, a shrewd entrepreneur, of a local regime. It is a disturbing encounter that may help us deal with the destabilizing pressure of transglobal trade of people, pressure that can make us cling or discredit other cultures, other languages, make us rank evil according to the fashion of the day, make us legislate, expel, conform, purge, and pledge allegiance to ghosts and fantasies. Most of all, this pressure can make us deny the foreigner in ourselves and make us resist to the death the commonness of humanity. After many trials, enlightenment slowly surfaced in Karma Lay's Westerner. Clarence gets his wish to meet the king, but by then he and his purpose have altered. Against the advice of the local people, Clarence crawls naked to the throne. When he finally sees the king, who is a mere boy laden with gold, the terrifying void that is within him, the void that he has been protecting from disclosure, opens to receive the royal gaze. It is this openness, this crumbling of culture, armored, maintained out of fear, this act of unprecedented courage that is the beginning of Clarence's salvation, his bliss and his freedom, wrapped in the boy's king's embrace. Feeling the beat of his young heart, Clarence hears him murmur the exquisite words of authentic belonging, words welcoming him to the human race. Did you not know that I was waiting for you? Race and fascism. Let us be reminded that before there is a final solution, there must be a first solution, a second one, even a third. The move toward a final solution is not a jump. It takes one step, then another, then another. Something perhaps like this. Construct an internal enemy as both focus and diversion. 2. Isolate and demonize that enemy by unleashing and protecting the utterance of overt and coded name calling and verbal abuse. Employ ad hominem attacks as legitimate charges against that enemy. 3. Enlist and create sources and distributors of information who are willing to reinforce the demonizing process because it is profitable, because it grants power, and because it works. 4. Palisade all art forms. Monitor, discredit, and expel those that challenge and destabilize processes of demonization and deification. 5. Subvert and malign all representatives and sympathizers with the constructed enemy. 6. Solicit from among the enemy collaborators who agree with and can sanitize the dispossession process. 7. Pathologize the enemy in scholarly and popular mediums. Recycle, for example, scientific racism and the myth of racial superiority in order to naturalize the pathology. Criminalize the enemy. Then prepare, budget for, and rationalize the building of holding arenas for the enemy, especially its males, and absolutely its children. Reward mindlessness and apathy with monumentalized entertainment and with little pleasures. Tiny seduction, a few minutes of television, a few lines in the press, a little pseudo success. The illusion of power and influence, a little fun, a little style, a little consequence. Maintain at all costs silence. In 1995, racism may wear a new dress, buy a new pair of boots, but neither it nor its succubus twin, fascism, is new or can make anything new. It can only reproduce the environment that supports its own health, fear, denial, and an atmosphere in which its victims have lost the will to fight. The forces interested in fascist solutions to national problems are not to be found in one political party or another, or in one another wing of any single political party. Democrats have no unsullied history of egalitarianism, nor are liberals free of domination agendas. Republicans have housed abolitionists and white supremacists. Conservatives, moderate, liberal, right, left, hard left, far right, religious, secular, socialists. We must not be blindsided by the Pepsi Cola, Coca-Cola labels, because the genius of fascism is that any political structure can host the virus, and virtually any developed country can become a suitable home. Fascism talks ideology, but it is really just marketing for power. It is recognizable by its need to purge, by the strategy it uses to purge, and by the terror of truly democratic agendas. It is recognizable by the determination to convert all public services to private entrepreneurship, all nonprofit organization to profit-making ones, to that the narrow but protective chasm between governance and business disappears. It changes citizens into taxpayers, so individuals become angry at even the notion of the public good. It changes neighbors into consumers, so the measure of our value as humans is not our humanity or our compassion or our generosity, but what we own. It changes parenting into panicking, so that we vote against the interests of our own children, against their health care, their education, their safety from weapons. And in effecting these changes, it produces the perfect capitalist, one who is willing to kill a human being for a product, a pair of sneakers, a jacket, a car, or kill generations for control of products, oil, drugs, fruit, gold. When our fears have all been serialized, our creativity censored, our ideas are market placed, our rights sold, our intelligence sloganized, our strength downsized, our privacy auctioned, when the theatricality, the entertainment value, the marketing of life is complete, we will find ourselves living not in the nation, but in a consortium of industries, and wholly unintelligible to ourselves except for what we see as through a screen darkly. Last year, a colleague of mine had asked me where I'd gone to school when a child. I told her Lorraine, Ohio. Then she questioned me. Were your schools desegregated then? I said, what? They were never segregated in the 30s and 40s. So why would they be desegregated? Besides, we had one high school and 4 junior high schools. Then I recalled that she herself was around 40 years old when that term desegregated was alive everywhere. Obviously, I was in a time warp, and obviously, the early diverse population of the town I grew up in was not the way of the country. Before I left Lorraine for Washington, D.C., then Texas, then Ithaca, then New York City, I thought every place was more or less like it, except in size. Nothing could be further from the truth. In any case, her question made me think anew about the area of Ohio and my recollection of home. This region, Lorraine, Illyria, Oberlin. It's not like it was when I lived here. But in a way, it doesn't matter because home is memory and companion and or friends who share the memory. But equally important as the memory and place and people of one's personal home is the very idea of home. What do we mean when we say home? It is a virtual question because the destiny of the 21st century will be reshaped by the possibility of the collapse of a shareable world. The question of cultural apartheid and or cultural integration is at the heart of governments and informs our perception of the ways in which governance and cultures compel the exoduses of peoples voluntarily or driven, and raises complex questions of dispossession, recovery, and the reinforcement of siege mentalities. How do individuals resist or become complicit in the process of alienizing others, demonization, a process that can infect the foreigner's geographical sanctuary with the country's xenophobia? By welcoming immigrants or importing slaves into their midst for economic reasons, or regulating their children to modern-day versions of the undead, or by reducing an entire native population, some with a history hundreds, even thousands of years long, into despised foreigners in their own country, or by the privileged indifference of government watching an almost biblical flood destroy a city because its citizens were surplus blacks, or poor because without transportation, water, food, help, and left to their own devices to swim, slog, or die in fetid water. Attics, hospitals, jails, boulevards, and holding pens. Such are the consequences of persistent demonization. Such is the harvest of shame. Clearly, the movement of peoples under duress at, beyond, and across borders is not new. Force an eager exodus into strange territory, psychological and geographical, is indelible in the history of every quadrant of the known world. From the trek of Africans into China and Australia to military interventions by Romans, Ottomans, Europeans, to merchants for a fulfilling the desires of a plethora of regimes, monarchs, and republics. From Venice to Virginia, from Liverpool to Hong Kong. All these and more have transferred the riches and art they found into other realms. And all these left that foreign soil stained with their blood and the transplanted into the veins of the conquered, while in their wake the languages of the conquered and the conqueror swell with condemnation of the others. The reconfiguration of political and economic alliances and the almost instant reparsing of nation states encouraging and repel the relocation of large numbers of people, excluding the height of the slave trade. This mass movement of people is greater now than it has ever been. It involves the distribution of workers, intellectuals, refugees, traders, immigrants, and armies all crossing oceans, continents, through customs offices, and via hidden routes, with multiple narratives spoken in multiple languages of commerce, of military intervention, political persecution, exile, violence, poverty, death, and shame. There is little doubt that the voluntary and involuntary displacement of people all over the globe tops the agenda of the state. The boardrooms, the neighborhoods, the streets. Political maneuvers to control this movement are not limited to monitoring the dispossessed. The transplantation of management and diplomatic classes to globalization's outposts, as well as the deployment of military unit and bases featured prominently in legislative attempts to exert authority over the constant flow of people. This slide of people has frightened the concept of citizenship and altered our perception of space, public and private. The strain has been marked by a plethora of hyphenated designation of national identity in press descriptions. Place of origin has become more telling than citizenship. A person are identified as a German citizen of such and such origin, or a British citizen of such and such origin. All this while a new cosmopolitanism, a kind of multi-layered cultural citizenship, is simultaneously being hailed. The relocation of people has ignited and disrupted the idea of home and expanded the focus of identity beyond definition of citizenship to clarification of foreignness. Who is the foreigner? Is a question that leads us to the perception of an implicit and heightened threat within difference. We see it as defense of local against the outsider, personal discomfort with one's own sense of belonging. Am I the foreigner in my own home? Of unwanted intimacy instead of safe distance. It may be that the most defining characteristic of our times is that, again, walls and weapons feature as prominently now as they once did in medieval times. Porous borders are understood in some quarters to be areas of threats and certain chaos, and whether real or imagined, enforced separation is posited as the solution. Walls, ammunition, they do work for a while, but they are major failures over time, as the occupants of casual, unmarked, and mass grave sites haunt the entire history of civilization. Consider another consequence of the blatant, violent uses to which foreignness is put: ethnic cleansing. We would be not merely remiss but irrelevant if we did not address the doom currently faced by millions of people reduced to animals, insects, or polluted status by nations with unmitigated, unrepentant power to decide who is a stranger and whether they live or die. At or far from home, I mentioned earlier that the expulsion and slaughter of enemies are as old as history, but there is something new and soul destroying about this last and current century. At no other period have we witnessed such a myriad of aggression against people designated as not us. Now, as you have seen over the last 2 years, the central political question was who or what is an American? From what I gather from those who have studied the history of genocide, its definition and application, there seems to be a pattern. Nation states, governments seeking legitimacy and identity, seem able and determined to shape themselves by the destruction of a collective other. When European nations were enthralled to royal consolidation, they were able to act out this slaughter in other countries: African, South American, Asian, Australia, and the United States. Self-declared republics required the annihilation of indigenous people, if not the usurpation of their land, to create their new democratic state. The fall of communism created a bouquet of new and reinvented nations who measured their statehood by cleansing communities. Whether the targets were of different religions, races, cultures, whatever, reasons were found first to demonize them, to expel or murder them. For an assumed safety, hegemony, or pure land grab, foreigners were constructed as the sum total of the punitive nation's ills. If these scholars are right, we will see more and more illogical waves of war, designed for the grasp of control by the leaders of such states. Laws cannot stop them, nor can God. Interventions merely provoke war talk. In trying to come to terms with the benefit and the challenges of globalism, it has become necessary to recognize that the term suffers from its own history. It is not imperialism, internationalism, or even universalism. Certainly, a major distinction between globalism and its predecessor is how much it is marked by speed, the rapid reconfiguration of political and economic alliances, and the almost instant reparsing of nation states. Both of these remapping encouraged and repel the relocation of large numbers of people. Excluding the height of the slave trade, this mass movement of people is greater now than it has ever been. It involves the distribution of workers, intellectuals, refugees, traders, immigrants, and armies crossing oceans, continents, through customs offices, and via hidden routes, speaking multiple languages of commerce or political intervention, of persecution, exile, violence, and defiling poverty. There is little doubt that the voluntary or involuntary displacement of people all over the globe tops the agenda of the state, the boardrooms, the neighborhoods, the streets. Political maneuvers to control the movement are not limited to monitoring the dispossessed. The transplantation of management and diplomatic classes to globalization's outposts, as well as the deployment of fresh military units and bases, feature prominently in legislative attempts to exert authority over the constant flow of people. This slide of people across the globe has altered and frightened the concept of citizenship. The strain has been marked by a plethora of hyphenated designation of national identity in the United States by press description where origin is of more significant than citizenship. People are described as German citizens of fill in the blank origin or British citizen of blank origin. All this while a new cosmopolitanism, a kind of cultural citizenship, is simultaneously being held. The relocation of peoples that globalism ignites has disrupted and sullied the idea of home and has expanded the focus of identity beyond definition of citizenship to clarification of foreignness. Who is the foreigner? Is the question that leads us to the perception of an implicit threat with indifference. The interests of global markets, however, can absorb all these questions, thrive, in fact, on multiplicity of differences. The finer, the more exceptional, the better, since each difference is a more specific, identifiable consumer cluster. This market can reconstitute itself endlessly to any broadened definition of citizenship, to ever narrowing, proliferating identities, as well as the disruption of the planetary war. But unease creeps into the conversation about this beneficial morphing ability when the flip side of the citizenship is address. The chameleon-like characteristic of global economy provokes the defense of local, raises newer questions of foreignness. A foreignness that suggests intimacy rather than distance. Is he my neighbor? And a deep personal discomfort with our own sense of belonging. Is he us? Am I the foreigner? These questions complicate the concept of belonging, of home, and are telling in the alarm apparent and many quarters regarding official, prohibited, unpoliced, protected, and subversive languages. There is some grasping at what North Africans may have done or are capable of doing to the French, of what Turkish people made of German, of the refusal of the Catalan speakers to read or even speak Spanish, the insistence on the Celtic in schools, the academic study of Ojibwe, the poetic evolution of the New Yorkian, even some feeble and I think misguided effort to organize something called Ebonics. The more globalism trumps language differences by ignoring, soliciting, and engulfing them, the more passionate these protections and usurpations become. For one's language, the one we dream in, is home. I believe it is in the humanities, and specifically the branch of literature, where such antagonism becomes rich field of creativity and thus ameliorate the climate between cultures and itinerant people. Writers are key to this process for any number of reasons, principal among which is the writer's gift for teasing language, eliciting from its vernacular, its porous lexicon, and the hieroglyphics of the electric beauty. This work is not new for writers, but the challenges are, as all language, major and dominant, minor and protected, are reeling from the imposition of globalism. Yet globalism's impact on language is not always deleterious. It can also create odd and accidental circumstance in which profound creativity erupts out of necessity. Let me suggest one case in point, where severe changes in public discourse have already taken place as communication floods virtually every terrain. The language of war has historically been noble, summoning the elevating quality of warrior discourse, the eloquence of grief for the dead, courage and the honor of vengeance. The heroic language rendered by Homer, Shakespeare in the sagas, and by statesmen is rivaled for beauty and force only by religious language, with which it frequently merges. In this parade of inspiring war talk, from BC to the 20th century, there have been disruptions. One moment of distrust and disdain for such language occurred immediately after World War I, when writers like Ernest Hemingway and Wilfred Owen, among others, questioned the paucity of terms such as honor, glory, bravery, courage to describe the reality of war, the obscenity of those terms being associated with the carnage of 1914 through 1918. As Hemingway wrote, I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice, and the expression in vain. We had heard them, sometimes standing in the rain almost out of earshot, and I had seen nothing sacred. And the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like the stockyards of Chicago if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. There were many words that you could not stand to hear, and finally, only the names of the places had dignity. But the events of 1938 quieted those interventions, and once more the language of war rose to the occasion of World War II. Glamour-coated images we carry of Roosevelt, Churchill, and other statesmen are due in part to their rousing speeches and our testimony to the strength of military orator. Yet something interesting happened after World War II. In the late 50s and 60s, war continued. In course, hot and cold, north and south, big and small, more and more cataclysmic, more and more heartbreaking, because so unnecessary, so wildly punitive on innocent civilians, one could only drop to one's knees in sorrow. Yet the language that accompanied these recent wars became oddly diminished. The dwindling persuasiveness of the combat discourse may have been due to the low requirement of commercial media, their abhorrence of complex sentences and less known metaphors, their dominance of the visual over linguistic communication. Or perhaps it was due to the fact that all these wars were the seething mute children of preceding ones. Whatever the case, warrior discourse has become childlike, puny, vaguely pubescent. Underneath the speeches, bulletins, pundries, essay lies the clear whine of the playground. He hit me. I did not. Did too. That's mine. It is not. It's too. I hate you. I hate you. This decline, it seems to me, this echo of passionate juvenilia affects the highest level of contemporary warrior discourse and sounds like that of the comic book or action film. I strike for freedom. We must save the world. Houston, we have a problem. And a name in feeble screed has emerged to address brain-cracking political and economic problems. What is fascinating is that such language sank to its most plodding at precisely the time another language was evolving, the language of nonviolence, of peaceful resistance, of negotiation, the language of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King Jr., of Nelson Mandela, of Václav Havel. Compelling language, robust, rousing, subtle, elevating, intelligent, complex. As war's consequences became more and more dire, war talk has become less and less credible, more infantile in its panic. A change that became obvious just at the moment when the language of resolution and of diplomacy was developing its own idiom, a moral idiom worthy of human intelligence, shedding the cloud of weakness, of appeasement that historically has hovered above it. I don't want to believe the shift is coincidental. I believe it represents a fundamental change in the concept of war, a not-so-secret conviction among various and sundry populations, both oppressed and privileged, that war is, finally, out of date. That is truly the most inefficient method of achieving one's long-term aims. No matter the paid parades, the forced applause, the instigated riots, the organized protests, pro or con, self or state censoring, the propaganda, no matter the huge opportunity for profit and gain, no matter the history of the injustice, at Bottom, it is impossible to escape the suspicion that the more sophisticated the weapons are of war, the more antiquated the idea of war, the more transparent power grab, the holier the justification, the more arrogant the claims, the more barbaric, the more discredited the language of war has become. Leaders who find war the sole and inevitable solution to disagreements, displacement, aggression, injustice, abasing poverty seems not only helplessly retrograde, but intellectually deficient, precisely like the empurpled comic book language in which they express themselves. I understand that my comments may appear disjunctive on this date in 2002, when legislatures, revolutionaries, and the inflamed do not declare war, but simply wage it. But I am convinced that the language that has the most force requires the most acumen, talent, grace, genius, and yes, beauty will never again be found in paeans to the glory of war or erotic rallying cries to battle. The power of this alternate language does not arise from the tiresome, wasteful art of war, but rather from the demanding, brilliant art of peace. The war on error. I accepted the invitation to speak at Amnesty International with instant glee. I didn't have a second thought about the opportunity to address an extraordinary community of active humanitarians whose work I so profoundly respect. The honor pleased and challenged me, and I believed it would be relatively effortless to find something of consequence to say to you. Months later, however, I began to have grave reservations about my early and unthinking enthusiasm. Benumbed with news of ignited chaos, death tolls, manufactured starvations, wars of choice against disarmed countries, I became virtually speechless, startled into mute disbelief, disabled by what I understood to be the equanimity of Congress and inert parliaments going about their business of business. The irrelevance, sensationalism of mainstream media, its strange quietude on vital issues, its publicity posing as journalism did their job and mangled my own helpless, unspeakable thoughts. Although an obvious theme for this occasion occurred to me, a rehearsal of salutations and compliments to AI, I realized at last that the time for compliments has passed. Although I am amazed by the breadth and depth of AI's resiliency, I came to believe this is no time for self-congratulation, although there is a room for it, room to recall and marvel at the record of AI has garnered, its impact on the lives of forgotten, and its success in tarnishing the glitz of the mighty. Unaligned, nobly interventionists, unbrooked by nations and political parties, private interests, or public exhaustion. Amnesty International declares states, walls, borders irrelevant to its humanitarian goals, detrimental to its task, by summoning responsibility and refusing to accept a myopic government's own narrative of its behavior. I can share the seethe of millions, but it won't do. Rage has limited uses and serious flaws. It cuts off reason and displaces constructive action with mindless theater. Besides, absorbing the lies, untruth, both transparent and nuance of governments, their hypocrisy so polished it does not even care if it is revealed, can lead to a wearied and raveled mind. We live in a world where justice equals vengeance, where private and profit drives public policy, where the body of civil liberties, won cell by cell, bone by bone, by the brave and the dead, withers in the searing heat of all war all the time, and where, facing internal war, respect for, even interest in humanitarian solution can dwindle, even as the convictions that the security of every other nation in the world be subordinate to the comfort of the United States is finally being challenged. Civil rights and humanitarian solutions are being steadily crushed by the imperatives of that conviction. Let me describe a little of what is happening in my country. Death penalty advocates are more and more entrenched, even as thousands of planned executions in Texas are forced into being reviewed because of blatant errors committed in DNA laboratories. A so-called Clear Skies Act, designed to replace the Clean Air Act, has exactly the opposite effect. Corporations, mining companies, factories can now ignore or delay every environmental safeguard put in place by the previous administration and turn death by breathing into gold. Constitutional rights are facing impoverishment and annihilation as the biggest, most undertold story in the United States is the looming disenfranchisement of the electorate. Under the Help America Vote Act of 2002, the new electric voting machines are said to be able to do what ATMs and grocery clerks do: provide a paper receipt documenting the voter's choice. This while any astute hacker can gain access. The largest manufacturers of these machines is able to calculate, perhaps control, the results in its home office. Withdrawals from treaties, preemptions, dismantlement, mass arrests, minus charges are legal representations. Judges instructed by the Justice Department to impose maximum terms. Whistleblowers fired. Draconian censorship. These actions are taking place in an atmosphere of aggression, panic, greed, and malice, remnants of the oppressive political architecture we believe we had demolished. But all this you already know. The history of your activity is the documentation and the intervention into such travesties. It seems to me that among the several wars being waged around the planet, one is paramount and surpasses in urgency all the others. That is the war against error. War against error is a phrase originated to describe the 15th and 16th century effort on the part of institutional religions to correct those who belief were different. In a time when and place where state religion is the norm, apostasy is literally treason. Our modern world has inherited a fully fledged apparatus of persecution and an intellectual tradition that justifies killing in the name of God. St. Thomas Aquinas himself wrote the apostates were to be severed from the world by death. The point in that medieval war was not the inherent evil of the dis or unbelieving, but his or her refusal to acknowledge his or her mistake. The lesson to be learned was acceptance or death. A hard education in a difficult school, the doors to which are still ajar. Freely, reverently, it is pried open by unbelievers as well as the faithful, by politicians as well as Enron, Halliburton, and WorldCom. Now that this medieval school has reopened, the old curricula are revised, rushing to teach the lessons. Administrations spin out of control, skipping between the cheating scholars' expedience and the dullards' violence, between courses on empire's fundamentalisms and seminars on theocratic domination. And nations and pseudo-states assert power that would make Caligula smile as they educate their pupils in purging, cleansing, slaughtering. Graduation parties are held where exploitation, assuming the seductive costume of globalism, dancing with any willing partner. In its pursuit, corporations plop themselves down in every corner of the globe selling democracy as though it were a brand of toothpaste, the patent to which they alone control. I think it is time for a modern wage against error, a deliberately heightened battle against cultivated ignorance, enforced silence, and metastasizing lies, a wider world that is fought daily by human rights organizations in journals, reports, index, dangerous visits, and encounters with malign oppressive forces. A hugely funded and intensified battle of rescue from the violence that is swallowing the dispossessed. If we have progressed psychologically, scientifically, intellectually, emotionally no further than 1492, when Spain cleansed itself of Jews, to 2004, when Sudan blocks food and remains content to watch the slow starvation of its own people, no further than 1572, when France saw 10,000 slaughtered on St. Bartholomew's Day, to 2001, when thousands were blown into filament in New York City, no further than 1692, when Salem burned its own daughters and wives and mothers, in 2004, when whole cities are choked with sex tourism feeding off the bodies of young girls and boys, then in spite of our shiny new communication toys, our gorgeous photos of Saturn, our sophisticated organs transplants, we are studying the same old curricula that waste the lives they cannot destroy. We turn to sorcery, summoning up a brew of aliens, enemies, demons, causes that deflect and soothe anxieties about gates through which barbarians stroll, anxieties about language falling into the mouths of others, about authority shifting into the hands of strangers. The desire, the mantra, the motto of these ancient educational systems is civilization in neutral, then grinding to a halt. And anyone who thinks otherwise is naive because there is a real danger in the world. Of course there is. That is precisely why a correction is in order. New curricula containing some powerful and visionary thinking about how the life of the moral mind and free and flourishing spirit can operate in contexts increasingly danger to their health. No more apologies for a bleeding heart when the opposite is no heart at all. Danger of losing our humanity must be met with more humanity. Otherwise, we stand meekly behind Eris, hold Nemesis cloaks, and genuflect at the feet of Thanthos. Enjoining the work of AI is more critical today than ever before because the world is more desperate, because governing bodies more hampered, more indifferent, more distracted and more inept, more deleted of creative strategies and resources, because media are increasingly cheerful pawns of the exchange market, couriers for corporations who have no national interests or loyalties and are committed to no public service. What strings these social perversions together? For me, it's profound error. Not only the error in questionable but unquestioned data, in distorted official releases, in censorship and the manipulation of the press, but also and especially faults deeply embedded in the imagination. A prime example is the inability or willingness to imagine future's future. The inability or unwillingness to contemplate a future that is neither afterlife nor the tenure of grandchildren. Time itself seems not to have future that equals the length or breadth of sweeps or even the fascination of its past. Infinity is now, apparently, the domain of the past. And the future becomes discoverably space, outer space, which is in fact the discovery of past time, billions of years of it. Random outbreaks of Armageddon and persistent apocalyptic yearnings suggest that the future is already over. Oddly enough, it is in the West where advance, progress, and change have been signatory features, where confidence in the enduring future is at the slightest. Since 1945, world without end has been subject to serious debate. Even our definition of the present have prefixes pointing backwards: postmodern, post-structuralist, post-colonial, post-Cold War. Our contemporary prophets look back behind themselves after what has gone on before. There are good reasons for this rush into the past for all our answers to contemporary problems. First, there is the happiness that is exploration, its revision, its deconstruction affords. One reason has to do with the secularization of culture, another to do with the theocratization of culture. In the former, there will be no Messiah, and afterlife is understood to be medically absurd. In the latter, the only existence that matters is the one following death. In both, sustaining human existence on this planet for another 500 million years is beyond such meditations, partly because it is the unknown, mostly because it may defer and displace contemporary issues like missionaries who were accused of diverting their converts' attention from poverty during life to rewards following death. I don't want to give the impression that all current discourse is unrelievedly oriented to the past and indifferent to the future. The social and natural science are full of promises and warnings that will affect us over very long stretches of time. Scientific applications are poised to erase hunger, annihilate pain, extend individual lifespans by producing illness-resistant people and disease-resistant plants. Communication technology is making sure that virtually everyone on the earth can interact with one another and be entertained, maybe even educated while doing so. We are warned about global change in terrain and weather that radically alters human environment. We are warned of the consequences of maldistributed resources on human survival and warned of the impact of over-distributed humans on natural resources. We invest in the promises and sometimes act intelligently on the warnings. But the promises trouble us with ethical dilemmas and a horror of playing God blindly, while the warning have left us less and less sure of how and which and why. The prophecies that win our attention are those with blank account large enough or photo op sensational enough to force debate and online corrective action, so we can decide which our war or political debacle or environmental crisis is intolerable enough. Which disease, which natural disaster, which institution, which plant, which animal, bird, or fish needs our attention most. These are obviously serious concerns. What is noteworthy among the promises and warnings is that other than products and a little bit more than personal time owning to improve health and more resources in the form of leisure and money to consume these products and services, the future has nothing to recommend itself. We are being seduced into accepting truncated short-term CEO versions of the world's holy human race. The loudest voices are urging those already living in day-to-day dread to think of the future in military terms as a cause for an expression of war. We are being bullied into understanding the human project as manliness contests where women and children are the most dispensable collateral. If scientific language is about longer individual life in exchange for an ethical one, if political agenda is the xenophobic protection of a few of our families against the catastrophic others, the religious language is discredited as contempt for the non-religious. If secular language bridles in fear of the sacred, if market language is merely an exercise for enticing greed, if future of knowledge is not wisdom but upgrade, where might we look for humanity's own future? Isn't it reasonable to assume that projecting earthly human life into the far distant future may not be the disaster movie we have come to love, but the reconfiguration of what we are here for, to lessen suffering, to tell the truth, raise the bar, to stand one remove from timeliness, like an artist encouraging reflection, stoking imagination, mindful of the long haul, and putting his own and her own life on the line to imagine works in a world worthy of life, for a future that perhaps only the young will be able to fully, purely to imagine. This new war against error has no guarantee of victory. Sentient life is original and very hard. A student of mine, probably 20 years old, recently gave me a piece of art, printed, cut, and pasted it within it were these lines. No one told me it was like this. It's only matter shot through with pure imagination. So rise up, little souls. Join the doomed army towards the meaning of change. Fight, fight, wage the unwinnable. He seems ready, and so are we. Yes? Thank you. I'm going to leave it at that because that's damn near 2 hours of reading. But to the ethos, tell the future. I said so.